Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking back at a really fascinating time for Bitcoin, specifically those years between, say, 2013 and 2016.
Right. A lot was happening then.
Yeah, some absolutely pivotal changes went live that, well, they dramatically boosted the flexibility of Bitcoin transactions. Think of this as your fast track to understanding a really important phase in how Bitcoin grew up, so to speak.
That's a good way to put it. We're diving into three key Bitcoin improvement proposals, the BIPs. There's CLTV, that's BIP 65, then CSV, BIP 112, and also BIP 68.
Okay.
And our mission really is to get why these technical steps allowed Bitcoin to become more than just, simple digital cash. They built the foundation for a lot of the advanced stuff we see now.
Absolutely. And they might just sound like alphabet soup, CLTV, CSV, but honestly, these changes, which seem kind of subtle, deep under the hood, they had some really profound effects, quite surprising ones, actually.
Definitely surprising for many at the time.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with CLTV.
Sounds good. So before CLTV landed in 2015, the main tool for time in Bitcoin transactions was this thing called unlock time.
Right, I remember it in lock time, transaction level, wasn't it?
Exactly. And that was part of the problem. It applied to the whole transaction, not specific bits. Plus, and this is crucial, it wasn't actually enforced by the script itself.
Ah, okay, so it could potentially be bypassed.
Potentially, yeah, or at least wasn't as robust. And it only handled absolute time, like a specific block number or a specific timestamp. This really put a cap on the kinds of, say, time-based contracts you could reliably build.
Okay, so it was limited. Then CLTV BIP 65 arrives. What did that change specifically?
CLTV brought in a new instruction, a script opcode, OP check lock time verify. Now, this was a real game changer.
How so?
Because it let you set absolute time locks, but on individual transaction outputs. So not the whole transaction like in lock time.
Oh, much more granular.
Precisely. And it was enforced right there in the script. Basically, if you tried to spend that output, the transaction doing the spending had to have its own unlock time set to be equal to or later than the time baked into the CLTV script.
Okay, right. So a much finer grained and more importantly, script enforced way to say this bit of Bitcoin stays put until this specific moment. What kind of doors did that open?
Well, a huge one was making a trust-minimized escrow and vault setups much more practical and secure.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Think, like, Alice wants to pay Bob, but they maybe want a safety net, like a lawyer, Lenny, involved, a 2 of 3 multi-sig.
Right, standard setup.
But with CLTV, you could add a twist. You could say, okay, any 2 of Alice, Bob, or Lenny can spend the funds immediately. But you could also add after, say, 6 months. Lenny plus either Alice or Bob can spend it.
Ah, like a backup release condition tied to time.
Exactly. A robust, time-sensitive fallback. Trying to do that securely before CLTV, it was complex, maybe even leaky. CLTV made it much cleaner, much safer.
That makes total sense. A built-in timeout escape hatch.
Yeah.
What else did CLTV enable?
It also made setting up one-sided payment channels quite a bit simpler. That initial funding step became more straightforward.
Interesting.
And maybe less commonly used, but still significant, it enabled simpler HODL contracts. Ways to provably lock up your own funds on-chain for a set time, like a public commitment.
Huh. Verifiably locking your own coins.
Yeah.
Okay, so technically, how did this work? You mentioned a new opcode.
Yeah, and what's neat is they repurposed an existing opcode, OP and OP2. It used to do nothing, basically.
Well, in a new job.
Exactly. And you'll often see OPDRP used right after CLTV in a script. That's just to clean up the time value left on the stack after the check.
Standard scripting hygiene.
Right. And CLTV itself has rules. It fails if the stack's empty or the time value is negative, or if the time type like block height versus timestamp doesn't match the transaction's unlock time type. It also fails if the script's time is later than the transaction's unlock time, or if a special field, the input's nSequence, is maxed out, which is like an opt-out flag. Keeps things locked down tight.
So quite a few checks built in. Makes sense. Were there challenges getting this adopted? Soft forks can be tricky.
Oh, absolutely. Implementing it as a soft fork, meaning older nodes still see the transactions as valid. Even if they don't fully get the new rule, that takes real care.
Because the old nodes don't enforce the CLTV rule, right?
Exactly. They might see those outputs as spendable by anyone, potentially. So the engineers had to be meticulous, design it so older nodes wouldn't break things or misinterpret these new types of outputs. Lots of testing, lots of coordination.
Okay, so CLTV nailed absolute time locks. But you mentioned there was still something missing, something about relative time.
Precisely. That brings us to CSV, which is BIP 112, and its partner, BIP 00068, both wrapped up around 2016. The missing piece was relative time locks, meaning a time delay that starts counting after a transaction gets confirmed in a block. Not a specific date, but an interval. Wait 100 blocks from now.
Ah, okay. Not wait until block 500,000, but wait 100 blocks after this is mine.
You got it. And neither in-lock time nor the original idea for the nSequence field really handled that well.
So how did BIP 0068 tackle that?
BIP 0068 essentially gave the nSequence field a new purpose, at least for newer transaction versions, version 2 or higher.
The field originally meant for replacing transactions, right? That didn't quite pan out.
Yeah, that use case never really took off, so BIP 68 repurposed it. Now, nSequence could encode these relative delays either as a number of blocks or in chunks of 512 seconds.
512 seconds. Why that number?
It's roughly 8.5 minutes, kind of a compromise unit. Powers of 2 are often convenient in binary. It also included a disable flag the very first bit. If that bit was set, the relative lock time meaning was switched off for that input.
Okay, so BIP 68 defines how to specify relative time in nSequence. Where does CSV BIP 112 come in?
CSV opcode verify is the opcode that actually enforces it in the script.
The enforcer got it.
Yeah. It looks at the relative time baked into the script and compares it to the nSequence value of the input trying to spend it. So BIP 68 gives you the language for relative time. CSV is the grammar checker making sure the rule is followed.
Language and grammar checker. I like that. Okay, so BIP 68 plus CSV gives us enforced relative time locks. What did that unlock? This sounds important.
Oh, it's huge. This is where things get really interesting. The biggest impact. Layer 2 protocols, specifically the Lightning Network.
Ah, okay. I suspected Lightning might come up.
CSV is utterly critical for Lightning's safety net, for things called HTLCs, hash time-locked contracts.
Right, the core mechanic of Lightning payments.
Exactly. They depend on these time-based conditions. If someone in a channel tries to cheat or goes offline, the other person needs a way to safely get their funds back after a certain time has passed. That's CSV in action.
So that relative delay is the safety window.
Precisely. Without CSV, building trustless off-chain channels like Lightning uses would be, well, probably impossible, certainly not securely. It also enabled things like irrevocable contracts you can effectively cancel or update within a time window, and just generally adding safety delays to transactions for security.
Wow, okay. So Lightning Network as we know it today really stands on the shoulders of CSV and BIP 68.
You could definitely say that. It's fundamental to the security model.
What about the technical side of CSV, similar to CLTV?
Pretty similar in concept. It also repurposed a NOP opcode, OP and OP3 this time.
Okay.
It requires transaction version 2 or higher, just like BIP 68. And the inputs in nSequence can't have that disable flag set.
Right.
Also, the type of relative lock time in the script blocks or 512-second intervals has to match the type encoded in the nSequence field.
Consistency checks.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And the implementation challenges. Redefining nSequence sounds tricky with old nodes around.
It was definitely a challenge. Making sure old nodes didn't get confused by the new meaning of nSequence required very careful use of bit masking and validation logic.
Right, ensuring backward compatibility.
Yeah. And remember, BIP 68, BIP 112, CSV, and actually another one, BIP 113, which tweaked how time was measured for these checks. They were all bundled together.
A package deal.
Right, which meant coordinating the activation across developers, exchanges, miners, everyone. They used BIP 9, where miners signal readiness by setting bits in the blocks they mine.
Miner signaling. That was a big topic back then.
It was. It worked, but it also, sparked debates later about how much, say, miners should have in activating protocol rules, an early test case for network upgrades.
Fascinating stuff. It really highlights how these technical upgrades are tied to the social layer, the community agreement.
Yeah.
You mentioned the BIP process itself. How important was that?
Absolutely crucial. The whole Bitcoin improvement proposal framework, that's where these ideas were formally written down, debated, picked apart, improved.
Open review.
Completely open. The focus was always on the technical arguments, the security implications, getting broad buy-in from developers and the wider community. The fact these 3 BIPs got through shows the process, at its best, really worked.
And the activation mechanism, BIP9 miners signaling, that was the path forward then.
It was the chosen path for these upgrades, yeah. Miners flipped the bits in their block headers. Once enough blocks in a signaling window showed support, Boom, the new rules locked in for everyone.
A coordinated switch.
A coordinated switch for a decentralized network. It was a significant early example of how Bitcoin could evolve. And like I said, it prompted later discussions about governance, but it got the job done for these BIPs.
So these weren't just code changes dropped from on high. They were part of a whole process. And successful ones, too. Did that success influence later upgrades?
Oh, definitely. The fact that CLTV, CSV, and BIP68 were activated as soft forks without splitting the chain or causing massive disruption, it basically created a template.
A software playbook.
Exactly. It showed you could add significant features while keeping the network whole and respecting backward compatibility. That confidence, that established process, really smoothed the path for bigger things later, like SegWit and Taproot.
Okay, let's zoom out. Looking back now, years later, what's the real long-term legacy of CLTV, CSV, and BIP68?
The impact is just huge, really. First, as we've hammered home, Lightning Network, CSV especially, with relative time locks, is the bedrock it's built on. No CSV, no secure Lightning as we know it.
So a massive boost for scalability potential.
Absolutely. Second, much better custody options. Time locks enable stronger self-custody. Think vaults where even if a key gets stolen, the funds can't be moved instantly because of a time delay. Or complex multi-sig setups with time-based recovery paths.
Enhanced security for holding your own keys, that's big.
Very big. Third, it just made Bitcoin script way more expressive. Still not Turing complete by design.
Right, for security.
But these time locks allowed for much more sophisticated conditional logic. This opened the door to all sorts of layer 2 ideas. Things like discrete log contracts, even early thoughts on covenants. Stuff that was pure science fiction before these BIPs.
So it expanded the design space for building on Bitcoin.
Massively. And then there's the upgrade process itself, the soft fork playbook we mentioned. That precedent was invaluable. And finally, I'd say the way these features were added. Narrow opcodes, specific functions, easy to analyze, reinforced Bitcoin's reputation for security through simplicity, even while adding power.
Wow. So it really feels like these weren't just incremental updates. They were like a fundamental shift in Bitcoin's DNA.
I think that's fair. CLTV, CSV, BIP68, you could call it a quiet revolution in the scripting layer.
Right.
They took Bitcoin from being mostly about simple payments to being a protocol you could program in much more interesting ways, especially around time.
And that programmability, that potential is still being explored today, right?
Absolutely. Innovation in scalability and security, in user sovereignty. A lot of it still traces back to the possibilities unlocked by these time locks.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Diving into the details really shows how these seemingly technical BIPs were foundational. It's amazing how much they enable.
It really is. They stand as great examples of how to extend Bitcoin's power carefully, responsibly, without breaking its core promises.
Thanks so much for walking us through that. A fantastic deep dive. It really clarifies how these changes opened up so much potential.
My pleasure, entirely. Glad we could cover it.
And for you, listening in, here's a thought to take away. We've talked about careful, consensus-driven change in Bitcoin with CLTV, CSV, and BIP68. How might those principles, that careful evolution, apply to other complex systems you see, maybe in technology, maybe elsewhere? What can Bitcoin's journey teach us? Something to think about until our next deep dive.